Welcome back. Tonight we'll be spending time in a small medieval village where the air smells like wood smoke and damp earth, but something else hangs over it too. Fear, the kind that follows women who gather herbs, or speak alone, or grieve too loudly. This is what it was like to be accused of witchcraft in the Middle Ages. Maybe quiet stories like this help your thoughts slow down just for a while. If they do, feel free to like and subscribe, but only if it brings you something gentle in return. And let others know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. There's something grounding about sharing the same quiet moment across so many different places. Now get comfortable, let the day fade, and let's slip quietly back, one step at a time, into the medieval world. She didn't say anything, just looked. That's how it started. A glance too long, too cold, or maybe just too tired. At the wrong moment, in the wrong place, toward the wrong person. She wasn't angry. She wasn't jealous. She was just exhausted after hauling firewood and stepping wrong on her bad foot. But when she turned her head and met his eyes, the miller's boy, the one who had just lost a pig, she didn't smile. She didn't lower her gaze. She simply looked. And in a place where every action whispered meaning, silence itself became accusation. He told his mother. His mother told the priest. And the priest already had a list in his head of women who didn't quite fit. That list wasn't written down, but it lived in every whispered warning, every sidelong glance, every quiet step taken away when someone walked into the room. She had never been pretty, not even when she was young. And now, with her teeth worn and her cheeks sunken, she moved through the village like an apology. Someone people knew, but rarely greeted. She didn't go to church often, not because she doubted God, but because her joints hurt on damp mornings, and the church steps were steep. She lived alone since her sister died. No husband, no children, no family left. Just a crow that visited her roof and the smell of mint in her yard. It wasn't enough to be bad. In truth, she hadn't done anything wrong, but it was enough to be strange. And in a place like this, where sameness was safety, difference turned into danger. They remembered things differently once someone said the word, witch. Suddenly the children's stories about the woman who stared too long made sense. The way her door creaked at night, the one time she laughed during a funeral, how the cat that used to follow her disappeared just before the hailstorm. It all fit together now. The way people looked at her changed. Not openly, but with an edge. Like they were bracing for something. Like they already knew she wouldn't deny it, because people like her didn't know how. And she saw it all. Every shift in tone, every slow, deliberate nod, every question that wasn't a question, just a warning wrapped in politeness. She tried to act normal, to smile when spoken to offer help with the bread oven or lend her wooden spoon for the feast. But her hands shook when she did it, and that only confirmed their suspicions. Guilty people trembled, didn't they? And when she brought herbs for the sick boy, ones she had used before, ones that had helped, they said the fever grew worse that night. Maybe it did. Maybe it didn't. But they said it, and so it became true. The wrong look had already happened. The thread had already unraveled. Now she was just the woman at the end of it, caught, wrapped tight, and waiting for the fire they swore they didn't want but might need just in case. She kept them in clay jars, lined in rows on a wooden shelf too old to stand straight. Some were marked with charcoal symbols, others left blank, their scents the only label she needed. Chamomile for fever, yarrow for bleeding, mugwort for dreams. The widow didn't speak of magic. She didn't mutter spells or draw circles on the floor. She boiled water. She dried stems. She crushed roots with the back of a spoon. For years they came to her with burns, with coughs, with children who wouldn't sleep, or mothers who couldn't stop. They came when the midwife was too far or the priest's prayers weren't enough. They came because she listened, not just with her ears, but with the practiced stillness of someone who had been alone too long. Her hands, though gnarled with age, moved like memory. She never wrote anything down. It was all in her body. No one minded her skill when it worked. When the baby cried again, or the swelling eased, or the bleeding slowed, they thanked her. Not with coins, but with bread, with eggs, with mumbled words of appreciation barely loud enough to be heard. But healing, in those days, was a game played with death. When a child didn't wake, or the wound turned black, or the labor stretched on into silence, someone had to be blamed. And if she had given the tea, or touched the brow, or said the wrong thing at the wrong time, it became hers. Worse still was when her medicine worked too well. When the paralyzed man walked again. When the girl with the bruises smiled and stopped flinching. People talked, not of miracles, but of bargains. They whispered of help too sudden, of pain that fled too quickly. How could it be natural if even the priest hadn't managed that much? Her husband had died 15 winters ago, a fever that cooked him from the inside, and no herb she knew could pull it out. Since then, she hadn't let another man into her house, though many had tried, some with kindness, some with threat. She walked alone in the woods and came back with handfuls of green, her apron always damp with dew, her fingers stained with plant juice, her breath tinged with the scent of sage and garlic. No one saw her laugh, no one heard her cry. She lived between houses, between people, between the known and the feared. And so, when the mayor's daughter broke out in boils and the poultice didn't help, it was easy to turn. Not on the disease, not on the sin, but on the one who touched both body and soil and didn't ask permission. It started quietly. A question asked twice. A visitor who stopped coming. A boy who ran from her gate. Then a broken jar. Then silence. She knew the signs. Knew them like the veins on the back of her hand. She stopped brewing, but the smell of rosemary clung to her walls. She stopped offering help, but her very presence became accusation. When the priest came, he didn't ask much, just looked. At her shelf, at her hands, at the way her lips pressed into each other and refused to move. They found a dried toad in a pouch by the door, a charm she had forgotten, meant to keep rats away. They called it an offering. They called her a liar. They said God's light had never touched her. And maybe it hadn't, not because she rejected it, but because no one had ever shown her how to reach it, not without burning everything else first. The pig had been fine the day before. It ate well, snorted at the boy who fed it, wallowed in the cool mud behind the barn. There was no sign, no limp, no cough, no blood. But in the morning, it lay stiff on its side, eyes glassy, legs curled unnaturally beneath it. The stench came quickly, even before the farmer's shout woke the yard. By noon, the men were standing in a tight circle, kicking at the dirt, muttering about rot and curses and signs. Someone mentioned the grain. Someone else mentioned the weather. But neither of those things had a face. Neither could be called to answer. And as the sun rose higher, the same name came up, again and again, spoken carefully at first, then with more confidence. Not because they believed it, but because it felt like a lid on boiling water. Her name was a kind of closure. She hadn't been near the pig. She hadn't even spoken to the farmer in weeks. But last month she had refused him herbs, not out of spite, but because the herb he wanted needed time to regrow. Time he didn't have. He'd walked away angry, with words she couldn't hear. And now his animal was dead. That was enough. A few said it might have been worms or heat or something it ate. But those explanations required silence and patience, and neither were abundant in a village where mouths ran faster than thought. By supper, no one was talking about the pig's illness. They were talking about her hands, about the way she looked at people, about how last spring she had guessed the butcher's wife was pregnant before the woman herself had known. They said that wasn't natural, that maybe she hadn't guessed, maybe she'd planted the seed. When they came to her door, they weren't angry yet. They were curious. That was worse. Anger burns out, curiosity lingers, and it demands answers. They asked if she had seen the pig. She said no. They asked if she'd heard of other sick animals. She said she hadn't. Then they asked if she'd been praying, not to God, but to anything else. Her mouth opened, but nothing came. And that, too, became a kind of answer. A silent refusal to explain. A lack of fear mistaken for defiance. A woman who didn't cry when spoken to by men. They walked away nodding to themselves, and when they left, they didn't close the gate. That meant something. The next morning, 2 chickens were missing from the widow's yard on the other side of the lane. That was her fault, too. By the end of the week, a whole section of the field had gone yellow. And even though she hadn't planted it, hadn't touched it, hadn't looked at it, it was her doing. The pig had only started it. Her house became quieter. Not inside, that stayed the same. The sound of boiling water, the broom across the floor, the soft clink of spoons against clay. But outside, the silence grew. People walked around it instead of past. Children whispered as they passed the windows. The baker's apprentice threw something at the wall one morning. Something hard, something that cracked. She didn't go out to see what it was. She knew. The pig was just one life. But that one life had bled into others. And now everything that failed, everything that spoiled, everything that broke, it all traced back to her. Not because they could prove it, but because it was easier than admitting the world broke on its own. Easier than living with the idea that pain came without reason, and that pigs died not from curses, but from air and time and the things no one could see. Easier to have a target, easier to have a witch. It always began when the fire dimmed and the last chores were done. When the fields were black with night and the only sounds were the creak of rafters and the shuffle of bare feet on packed earth. That's when the voices started. Low, breath-warm, passed from lip to ear in kitchens and under blankets. Someone said she was seen in the woods again. Not gathering, not walking, just standing, too still, too long. Someone else heard she had a book. Not a Bible, not anything in Latin. A book with no title, pages worn, and symbols that no one could explain. A third voice, softer still, spoke of candles in her window, long past midnight. And a shadow moving behind them that didn't match the shape of her shoulders. These whispers didn't accuse, not at first. They just floated, weightless, unfinished, waiting for someone braver to give them shape. By morning, no one remembered who said what, but the air had changed. People greeted each other with narrowed eyes. The butcher's wife asked twice about the milk. The priest mentioned vigilance in his sermon. And in the silence between words, something dark took root. In a place where news traveled on foot and memory bent like branches in wind, a whisper could be stronger than truth. It didn't need facts. It needed only fear. And once it started, it found more to feed it. A girl said she felt watched at the well. A boy claimed his dog wouldn't go near her garden. A man swore he saw her talking to something, not someone, under the old tree near the riverbank. None of them knew what they had seen, but each story made the next easier to believe. That's how it worked. No one asked her. No one knocked on her door and said her name with kindness. They didn't want answers. They wanted distance, a space between themselves and the danger they'd invented. And so, the whispers turned sharp. She was the reason the bread spoiled. She was why the baby coughed at night. She caused the fever, the limp, the bruise no one could explain. Her silence became arrogance. Her solitude became secrecy. She was watched constantly, though no one admitted it. Eyes behind shutters. Heads turned just slightly as she passed. People crossed themselves without thinking, and always, the whispers grew louder once the sun went down. She knew. Of course she knew. You can feel when you're being unmade, when your image unravels in the mouths of others and comes back twisted, monstrous. She heard them even when she didn't hear them. The way voices dropped when she entered a room. The way children looked at her and looked away. The way someone left a string of garlic on her doorstep and called it protection. She swept it aside with the broom and said nothing. Not out of guilt, not out of fear, but because she'd learned long ago that once the whispers began, there was no speaking over them. They echoed through walls. They shaped the silence. And sooner or later, someone would take them seriously enough to act. Not because they believed them, but because it was easier to punish one body than to face the dark that truly lived in all of them. He stood at the front of the chapel, cloaked in black, eyes cast downward as if humility were a physical thing he could wear like wool. But his voice always carried, clear, firm, shaped by years of speaking into silence. The villagers listened because they had been taught to. Because his words came from God, or so they believed. But not every sermon was about grace or forgiveness. Sometimes he spoke of vigilance, of hidden sins and secret pacts, of the devil's hand reaching through the veil of ordinary life. He didn't name names. He didn't have to. The shape of his shadow fell long and quiet across the pews, and everyone felt it, that tremor in the gut that told them they were being watched. Not by heaven, but by him. He wasn't a cruel man, not openly. He baptized their children, blessed their fields, offered comfort at the bedsides of the dying. But he also saw everything, who missed Mass, who whispered too long in the market, who gave offerings with reluctant hands. And when something went wrong, a cow stillborn, a wife struck down by fever, a child who wouldn't speak, he was the one they came to, desperate for a cause, a reason, someone to blame. And slowly, methodically, he gave them answers. Not all at once, just a word here, a raised brow there, a mention of a woman whose herbs smelled strange, a reminder that solitude breeds temptation. He let the fear bloom on its own, and when it ripened, he harvested it. Not out of malice, but necessity. A frightened village was a manageable one, and an accused woman was a cautionary tale. He knew how to choose them. Not the noble or the wealthy. They had voices, allies, names carved into church benches. No, he chose the ones with soft footprints and quiet mouths. The widow who sat in the back row, the girl with no dowry, the old healer who hadn't taken confession in years. They were easy to mark, easy to press down. And when the time came, when enough had been whispered and enough heads had nodded, he would speak from the pulpit with the weight of certainty. Not accusation, not quite, just concern. Concern that the sickness might be more than flesh, that some among them had let evil through the cracks. The villagers always understood. They didn't ask for proof. They only asked who. The priest never touched the rope. He never lit the fire, but his presence hung over the trials like smoke. He watched from a distance, hands folded, eyes heavy with sorrow that didn't quite reach his mouth. He told them to pray. He reminded them that justice belonged to God, even as he stirred the coals beneath it. And after, when it was done, he gave the last rites with a steady voice and a clean conscience. Not because he believed in the guilt of the condemned. That was never the point. The point was order. The point was fear. The point was power shaped into a collar and cross. He was the shepherd, and sometimes, to keep the flock together, a few sheep had to burn. She had seen more births than the priest, the mayor, and the healer combined. Not because she was trained, but because she was called, again and again, when the blood started, when the cries came too early or too late, when the husbands stood helpless in doorways and the mothers gripped bedsheets with cracked hands. She had seen women tear, scream, go quiet. She had pulled breathless babies from blue-skinned bellies and rubbed them until they wailed. She knew how to fold linens to hide the bleeding, how to brew a broth that steadied shaking limbs, how to listen for the sound that meant a second child was coming, though no one expected it. Her knowledge didn't come from books. It came from bodies, messy, loud, vulnerable, and that made it dangerous, because what she knew couldn't be controlled. Not by the men who wore robes, not by the ones who signed land titles, not by those who thought wisdom should come with ink and permission. At first, they respected her. In the quiet way that villages do, nods in passing, murmured thanks, loaves of bread left on the stoop. They didn't ask where she learned. They were too relieved when the baby breathed. But relief has a short memory. And in a place where pain was expected, where death during birth was considered natural, her success began to look unnatural, especially when she saved the wrong people. A girl who had sinned in the hayloft, but lived. A merchant's wife who had failed 3 times and finally bore a son. They said she interfered, that she meddled where God had already spoken. The priest asked her what prayers she used. She said none. The healer asked her which humors she balanced. She said she just watched. That was the wrong answer. Men didn't like things they couldn't name, and what she knew about tearing, about stretching, about how to stop the bleeding when it came like a flood wasn't in their vocabulary. They started to avoid her eyes. They didn't stop calling her. Not yet. But they waited longer. They prayed first, then knocked. They whispered more during the labor, as if her presence were a necessary risk. And if the birth failed, if the mother slipped into fever, or the child refused to cry, the questions came quickly. What did you do? What did you give her? What did you say when no one else was listening? She always answered plainly, but her voice, so used to firm instructions and fast decisions, now sounded like defiance. And when the priest's niece died during her 2nd day of bleeding, after a long and broken labor, it didn't matter that the girl had arrived half dead. It didn't matter that the child was tangled in the cord. They remembered that the midwife had touched her last. They remembered the herbs on her breath. They remembered that she had said the word womb in a room where men could hear. That was enough. They didn't need proof. They needed unease. And she gave them that without meaning to. She moved with certainty in spaces where others froze. She knew what blood meant and didn't flinch when it came. She didn't faint at pain. She didn't bow to mystery. She had cut cords with a blade. She boiled herself. She had lifted lifeless babies and whispered to them until something, sometimes, flickered back into their lungs. It looked like magic to those who knew nothing but fear. And fear needs shape. Fear needs a name. She became it. Not because she failed, but because she succeeded too often, too calmly, and without asking for permission. That kind of knowing couldn't be trusted. Not when it lived in the wrong body. Not when it wore a dress and carried no husband's name. Not when it was older than the men who judged her. So they called her unnatural. And that was the first step toward calling her worse. She lived at the edge of the village, in a house too small for more than one bed, and too quiet for more than one voice. The roof sagged in the middle, the fence leaned sideways, and the path to her door was barely more than trampled grass. No one came to check on her unless they needed something. She had no husband to speak for her, no sons to defend her, no brothers nearby to cast long shadows on her behalf. She had once been promised, long ago, but the boy she was meant to marry died before the harvest, and after that, no one else asked. Not out of spite, just out of silence. A woman without a man in her house was seen as unfinished, as lacking a purpose. She had to carry water alone, chop wood alone, carry her illness alone. And when the whispers started, she had to carry those too. In the village, protection was never about walls. It was about names, alliances, hands that reached for yours when you stumbled. A married woman, even one who was disliked, had witnesses. If her door was knocked in the night, there was someone to hear it. If she was accused of something, there were people who would speak, not out of love, but because they would be expected to. But for her, there was no buffer. Her word was just her own. If someone came and shouted her name, it echoed back hollow from the hills. If someone claimed she cursed their field, no one stood to say they had seen her elsewhere. Her days passed unnoticed, her evenings unaccounted for. That kind of invisibility wasn't safe. It was a blank page others could write on, and they did, with quick hands and loud certainty. She tried to be useful. She mended clothes. She traded eggs. She helped gather herbs in spring and offered salt in the winter when the roads froze and travel became dangerous. But usefulness wasn't loyalty. People took what they needed and left without thanks. If she smiled too long at a child, they said she wanted to steal it. If she frowned at a man, they said she was bitter. There was no correct way to exist without a man beside her. Too quiet, she was hiding something. Too loud, she was angry at the world. She hadn't chosen solitude. It had chosen her, slowly, through seasons of not quite being asked, not quite being needed, not quite being invited. And once it wrapped around her like a shawl, it became the only thing she owned. No witnesses, no protection. So when the rumors came, that she kept strange powders, that her eyes were too sharp, that she walked the woods at night, no one asked her if they were true. They simply nodded, murmured, passed it on. The men knew she wouldn't fight back. The women knew better than to defend her. The priest never said her name, but his gaze paused longer on her pew. And she sat there, week after week, hands folded, mouth shut, knowing it wouldn't help. Innocence without an alibi was no better than guilt, and alibis needed people. People who saw you, people who stood with you. She had none. Just the ache in her bones and the knowledge that when the shouting started, and it always did, eventually, there would be no one to stand between her and the fire. It was the size of a lentil, tucked just beneath her left shoulder blade, where the skin folded slightly when she bent to lift a bucket. She had it since childhood, a small, dark mole, harmless and ordinary. She'd never thought much of it, but once the accusation came, they wanted to see her skin. All of it. They stripped her in a cold room with stone walls and damp air, and they turned her body into evidence. They looked not for wounds or signs of harm, but for marks, anything unusual, anything that might be called unnatural. A freckle, a scar, an old burn from the hearth. They touched them with long sticks, with gloves, with iron instruments made for poking. And when she didn't flinch, when one particular spot felt nothing at all, they nodded. The devil's mark feels no pain, they said. That was enough. They believed the devil left a signature, not in fire or blood, but on skin. It didn't matter where, behind the ear, beneath the breast, at the base of the spine. The witches were said to carry it like a seal, a token of their pact. And since women's bodies were already treated like objects to be studied, it was easy to make this ritual feel medical, official. But it wasn't. It was invasive, humiliating, designed to break dignity before the burning ever began. And the mark didn't have to look like anything. It only had to exist, a pink spot that didn't fade fast enough, a rough patch from last winter's frostbite, a birthmark in the shape of nothing. They could find it on anyone if they looked hard enough. And they did, especially on women with no defenders. She tried to explain once that the scar on her thigh was from a dog bite, that the red spot on her ankle came from nettles, that the pale, smooth patch on her wrist was from a time she reached too close to the flame. But they didn't want stories. They wanted signs. The world was chaotic, and they needed proof that evil had a face, that it wore skin and bled like them. Her body became a map of sin. Every imperfection, every texture that didn't belong to a child became a clue. And when they found what they were looking for, and they always did, it became more real than anything she could say. The mark wasn't just proof, it was prophecy. They claimed it explained everything. Her herbs, her loneliness, the dead pig, the bad harvest, the stillborn child. That one dark spot on her shoulder, something she hadn't even noticed in years, now bore the weight of fear and fury. It didn't matter that they all had spots, that the old man's back was covered in moles, that the baker's wife had red veins on her legs, that the priest himself had a raised patch behind his ear. No one looked at them. They only looked at her. She was already marked in their minds. The skin just gave them a reason, and in that moment, she understood. It was never about the mark itself. It was about making her body into something less than human. Something shameful, something dangerous, something they could destroy without guilt. Because the devil had touched her, they said. And nothing the devil touched was allowed to remain. It came to her one autumn evening, skinny and soaked, with a torn ear and eyes too bright for its size. She didn't call it. It simply followed the smell of boiled grain and settled near her door, curled like a shadow. At first, she ignored it. There were already too many things in her life that breathed and needed. But the next morning it was still there, shivering and silent, and when she poured the leftover milk into a chipped bowl, it didn't meow, just looked at her, long and still, as if waiting. She never gave it a name. Naming made things real, and she'd already lost enough. But she let it stay. Not inside, but near. On the windowsill, on the fence post, beneath the bench where she shelled peas. And when the children passed her house and saw the black cat blink slowly from the shadows, they ran a little faster. No one cared at first. It was just a stray, and strays were everywhere. But then the baker's fire went out 3 times in 1 week. Then the mayor's wife claimed she felt a chill when she passed the cottage, even in sunlight. And someone remembered seeing the cat sitting on the church steps at dusk, licking its paw and not moving when the bell rang. That was when the questions started. Why did it follow her? Why didn't it fear people? Why did it only come out at night? No one asked whether those things were true. They simply told each other that they were. The cat, once a quiet and living thing, became a symbol, a signal, an extension of something darker. People had stories ready. They always did. Cats were said to be vessels, spirits, familiars. They drank milk and secrets, and they whispered prayers backwards, and it was always the black ones you had to watch. She tried to keep it away once the whispers began. She stopped feeding it. She clapped her hands when it neared, but it still came, brushing her legs when she drew water, watching her from the rafters when she stirred the pot. It didn't understand the fear that followed it. It had no words for guilt. And that, too, made it dangerous in their eyes. It moved without shame. It looked without lowering its gaze. It belonged to no one and went where it pleased. Like her, they said. Too free, too quiet, too certain of its place in a world that offered no welcome. When the priest asked if she had trained it, she laughed. Not cruelly, but from the sheer absurdity of the question. That was the worst mistake. Laughter, once they had decided what you were, became confession. So when the fire started near the granary and the wind blew it toward the northern fields, they didn't say it was an accident. They said the cat had been seen there, that it ran into the woods just before the smoke rose. They came to her door with eyes full of reason, holding tools meant not for animals, but for women. They didn't find the cat that night. It was gone, vanished like a secret finally too heavy to carry. But its absence only confirmed their truth. It had served its purpose and fled, left its mistress to take the weight. and she said nothing. Not because she agreed, not because she didn't mourn the small body that had once warmed her doorstep, but because there were no words they hadn't already reshaped. In the eyes of the village, she was never alone. She had a companion. She had a witness. She had a black cat. And that meant she had the devil. She spoke of it only once. It was after the second harvest, on a cool morning when the fog still clung to the fields, and the bread in the oven had not yet browned. She had been helping in the kitchen, hands dusty with flour, and the other women were tired, their mouths open with chatter just to fill the room. Someone mentioned bad dreams, wolves drowning, teeth falling out. She had laughed softly and said her dream had been strange too, but not frightening. She said she was walking alone through a wide meadow, barefoot, wearing nothing heavy, nothing coarse, no apron, no veil, her hair loose, the air warm. And no one was calling her. No one was waiting for her to finish or asking where she had been. She was just walking, and it felt, she hesitated. It felt like being alive. That was all. A simple thing. But the silence that followed was not soft. No one asked her more. No one smiled or nodded. The woman next to her shifted slightly, as if something unpleasant had passed too close. They didn't speak of it again, not even later when the kitchen emptied and the firewood was stacked for supper. But from then on, she noticed how they watched her more carefully, how their voices quieted when she entered, how the priest began to linger near her pew longer than before. She didn't understand, not fully. It had only been a dream, not a prophecy, not a threat. But dreams weren't neutral in a place like this. Not for women. Women weren't supposed to roam in their minds. They were meant to stay where they were planted, even in sleep. And a dream where a woman was free, not just unburdened, but happy in her solitude, was dangerous, because it suggested she wanted something else, something outside the path laid for her. It wasn't about sin, it was about disobedience of thought. A woman who dreamed of her dead child was mournful. A woman who dreamed of falling was fragile, but a woman who dreamed of herself, not as a wife, not as a mother, not even as a servant, but simply as herself, was unsettling. Because she had imagined herself whole without anyone else. That meant she could imagine other things too, leaving, choosing, refusing. And so the village treated her not as wicked, but as unstable, someone who didn't know her place even in sleep. Someone who couldn't be trusted to keep her mind closed. They began to speak of her in the way people speak of spoiled bread, not with hatred, but with suspicion, as something that might still look fine, but shouldn't be eaten. She stopped sharing after that, stopped mentioning the night wanderings of her mind, though they grew stronger. Sometimes she dreamed of speaking, and no one interrupting. Sometimes she dreamed of flying, not on broomsticks or in storms, but through forests she had never seen, with moss beneath her feet and birds that didn't scatter. She didn't tell anyone. She barely told herself. But it was already too late. Someone had told the priest, and he had told the others, not directly, but through warnings disguised as sermons. He spoke of pride, of women who believed themselves wiser than their husbands, of those who kept strange thoughts and allowed darkness to enter their hearts. They knew he meant her. She knew it too. And so she kept her head down, tried to sleep less, tried to forget what her own mind had given her. But dreams don't listen. And in a world where even silence was suspicious, the only safety left was to lie about what she saw behind her eyes, or to stop dreaming altogether. She came when they called, always, rain or frost, night or dawn. The path to her door was worn with urgency, husbands pacing, mothers moaning, girls with round bellies and frightened eyes. She never asked questions. She brought her hands, her cloths, her herbs, her knowledge, and when the time came, she knelt beside the straw bed, caught the wet child in her palms, whispered something under her breath, and waited for a cry. Most of the time it came, sometimes too weak, sometimes too late, and sometimes it didn't come at all. Those were the births that stained her skin, not with blood, but with silence. No matter how she held the child, no matter how she rubbed, blew, whispered, the room stayed too quiet. The mother cried. The father stepped back, and the midwife became the reason. They never said it outright. Not at first. There were nods, slow and uncertain. Eyes that didn't meet hers when she passed in the market. A loaf of bread not paid for. A bowl left on the ground instead of handed to her. They said the baby was too small, born too early. But they also said she had touched the mother's belly wrong, or said something strange the week before. That maybe the herbs she gave made the child come too soon. That maybe her prayers weren't real ones. The women whispered it first, behind closed shutters, with hands clasped tight. Then the men said it louder, and soon the priest added it to his sermons, not her name, but her sin. The sin of trusting hands over God. The sin of women who tried to control life itself. She had been a midwife for more than 20 years. She had seen breech births, twisted cords, blue lips, mothers torn open. She had carried stillborn infants to the fire herself, wrapped in soft cloth, face never seen. She knew when a baby was lost before the mother did, sometimes even before labor began. There was a silence in the womb, a stillness that echoed through her fingertips. But she always tried, always stayed, always did everything she knew. And it was never enough. Because even when the child was born dead, long dead, curled tight and limp, they expected her to fix it, to bring life back from whatever place it had gone. If she failed, it meant she hadn't wanted enough, hadn't believed enough, or worse, had chosen not to. The worst part wasn't the accusations, it was the eyes of the mothers. Grief turned quickly into doubt. The same woman who held her hand during labor now pulled away. The same voice that cried for help now shook with blame. They didn't want her punished, but they needed a reason. Because if the baby died and no one was guilty, it meant it could happen again. To them, to their sister, to their next child. Blaming her made the world feel safer. Pain with a name was easier than pain without one. And so slowly, her name became a curse whispered through clenched teeth. The baby didn't breathe, they said. The midwife touched it first, they said. She had too many jars, too many herbs, too many secrets. She stayed too long in the room after the body went cold. She closed the child's eyes like she'd done it before. She was calm, too calm. And that calm, to them, looked like guilt. He wasn't the first to ask, and he wouldn't have been the last. But she said no. Not cruelly, not loudly, just firmly, without delay. She didn't want him. He smelled of ale and damp wool, and his hands were always too ready to rest on a woman's back. She had seen him before, puffed up with laughter that came too fast and silences that lasted too long. When he asked her to walk with him after the harvest feast, she shook her head. She didn't explain. She didn't smile. And something in his face changed. Not hurt, not surprised, but something colder. She thought it would pass. Most things did. But the next day someone whispered that she'd cursed a child's sleep. Then that her eyes were wrong, that she knew when cows would go dry. Within the week, she noticed people stepping a little farther away when she spoke. He never accused her outright. That would have been too bold and too obvious. Instead, he spoke of unease, of something in her that didn't sit right, of how she walked alone and didn't greet people like she used to, how she kept to herself, too much and too long. He told a story about how his brother had once asked her for help with his knee, and the pain only got worse after her tea. He added that he'd seen her talking to birds, that her garden bloomed too early, too long. He said it all lightly, as if in jest, as if warning friends not to take her too seriously. But the words stuck. They always did. Because when a man said a woman made him uncomfortable, others listened. Not to protect him, but to control her. His wounded pride became her danger. She began to feel it in the way the world tilted. The baker didn't look her in the eye. The miller's wife no longer offered to trade eggs. A child who once ran to her with open hands now clung to his mother's skirt when she passed. It wasn't just distance, it was judgment, thick as mud. She wanted to speak, to explain that saying no wasn't a sin, that silence wasn't guilt. But the moment had passed. The story had already grown teeth. She was proud, they said. She thought herself too good. Maybe she was jealous of the other girls who married. Maybe she had chosen another master. Maybe that was why the cat followed her. Maybe that was why the firewood around her house never stayed dry. What she didn't know was that he had done this before, not just to her, but to another girl who refused him. One who left shortly after, under quiet circumstances. But that didn't matter now. In their eyes, he had been kind, and she had embarrassed him. A man's humiliation had weight. A woman's rejection did not. And when fear needed a vessel, it looked for the woman who stood alone, the one with no husband to shield her, no father to speak in her place, the one who said no and didn't soften it with excuses, the one who didn't ask for forgiveness for her own will. That was the danger they couldn't allow. Not the witchcraft, not the herbs, but the decision, the defiance, the choice. A woman who refused a man once could refuse him again. Worse? She could show others how. And so they made her pay in the only currency they understood: shame, suspicion, and fire. They didn't call it punishment. Not at first. They called it justice, or protection, or simply what needed to be done. But it began with the hand. Not a whip, not rope, just the palm of someone who had decided her face didn't deserve peace. It came without warning, a crack across the cheek, dry and sharp, that turned her head before her thoughts could follow. No one stopped it. No one asked why. And once it happened, others joined in, as if her skin had changed, as if pain no longer mattered the same way. They said she had spoken ill, or cursed a cow, or looked at the wrong man too long. But the words didn't matter. The slap was the sentence. And it never stayed the only one. Spit came next. From mouths that had once asked her for help, for herbs, for bread. It landed in her hair, on her chin, on the ground near her feet. They didn't look at her when they did it, just turned their heads after like it had been a twitch, nothing more. The children copied. They learned fast. A stone here, a clod of mud there. Then whispers shouted too loudly to be just whispers. Then hands again. Not to hit this time, but to shove, to pull, to tie. When she stumbled, they said it was proof she couldn't walk like a proper woman. When she screamed, they said it was the devil's voice. When she stayed silent, they said she had something to hide. There was no right way to endure it. Every reaction confirmed the lie they needed. The fire wasn't the beginning. It was the end of a long unraveling. Before flames came ropes, before ropes came bruises, before bruises came stories, and fear, and a hunger for cleansing that had nothing to do with faith. They dragged her through mud, not because she resisted, but because it made her dirtier, easier to look at as something other, something no longer part of the village. They tore her clothes, not to expose her, but to reduce her, to take away anything that suggested she once mattered. By the time they tied her to the post, she was no longer a woman in their eyes, just a warning, just fuel, just something to be burned before the rot spread. The fire cracked loud, but moved slow. It always did. Heat first, then smoke, then pain so large it left the body behind. And still they watched, They watched like it meant something, like it would change them, cleanse them, make their crops grow better or their children sleep longer. Some crossed themselves, some wept, but most just stared. Because once you strike and spit and bind and lie, you have to see it through. You have to believe the fire is right. Otherwise you've built your world on ash. And the truth, that she was only a woman, with bad luck or strange eyes or too much silence, is too hard to hold. Easier to let her burn, easier to forget the slap that started it, easier to wait for the next one. He arrived in the village without dust on his boots, though the road had been dry for days. His cloak was clean, his voice careful, his posture practiced, a man who understood the weight of silence. He did not shout. He didn't need to. His presence said everything. He had been sent, or summoned, or perhaps he chose to come himself. It didn't matter. Once the Inquisitor crossed the village line, something changed in the air. People straightened their backs. Doors stayed open just long enough for glances. Children were hushed not with hands but with glances. He spoke little at first, walked the streets with slow steps, looked, just looked. That was all it took, because when a man like that looks long enough, someone will always be seen as guilty. He didn't ask for the truth. He already had it, tucked behind his tongue like a hidden blade. He spoke with those in power, the priest, the reeve, the landowner. He asked for names, not stories, and the names came quickly. Always women, always ones who lived a little off, a little sideways from the rest. The widow who never remarried, the girl who lost too many children, the healer who walked alone at night. He wrote nothing down. He didn't need to. The list was never longer than 5, never shorter than 1. 1 was all it took. His eyes didn't search, they confirmed. He looked at a woman and already knew what she was. Her posture, her hands, the way she held her breath when he passed. All of it read like a confession. No words needed. Her body spoke louder than any plea. The villagers watched him closely, but from a distance. They wanted safety, not involvement. They hoped he would take someone else. Someone who had always seemed strange. Someone who had already been whispered about. They gave small suggestions, careful nudges, not accusations, just doubts. They said, "She doesn't smile," or "She speaks to herself," or "My child got sick after she visited." The Inquisitor never smiled, but he nodded, slowly. Once, that was enough to confirm everything. Once the decision was made, the rest was routine. A visit, a question, a search. A body dragged forward and displayed not as a person, but as a problem being solved. The villagers looked at her differently now, not with hate, with relief. She wasn't them. That was all they needed. Sometimes she had already been chosen before he arrived. Sometimes the letter that summoned him carried her name. Sometimes her guilt was pre-written by another man's hand, the priests, the magistrates, a neighbor with influence. All he had to do was complete the process, the illusion of fairness, the ritual of inquiry. But the eyes gave him away. He never looked at her like she could be innocent. He didn't search for contradictions. He searched for confirmation, for the mole on her neck, for the hesitation in her voice, for the silence after a question that should have been easy. He had seen it all before, in 20 villages, 100, 1,000, and in each one the women looked the same when they were chosen, confused, then afraid, then empty, because they saw it too. The certainty in his eyes, the kind that doesn't leave room for mercy, or truth, or anything that might stop the fire. It started with the beans, thick, healthy stalks that climbed straight and fast, curling confidently around the wood frame she'd built with her own hands. While the other gardens wilted under sudden frost and bad seed, hers stood tall, glossy, and dark. The cabbages were full, tightly wound, with no rot at the core. Her onions fattened early. Her herbs never flowered too soon. There was always something in her apron: mint, sage, a handful of peas. She didn't boast. She didn't sell. She only grew what she needed and offered the rest when she had too much. But soon the quiet questions began. Why her soil? Why her hands? Why her rows, when the rest of the village dug and wept and cursed the sky? It wasn't fair, they said. Not allowed, not yet. But fairness in a place like this wasn't about effort. It was about matching outcomes. And when hers didn't match, the suspicion rooted deeper than the seeds. She had no secret, only a habit of turning the soil early and saving the ashes from her stove. She whispered to the plants when no one could hear, not with spells, but with care. She knew when to shade and when to water. She chased off snails with crushed eggshells and mulched with dry leaves before the rain. These were things her mother taught her, and her mother before that. But knowledge carried weight when it wasn't shared in books or prayers. It became strange, unclean. They said her garden was too green, too perfect, that it had grown too fast, that nothing flourished like that without help. Help from something else, something that didn't bless, but bargained. She laughed when she heard it at first, thought it was just hunger talking. A failed harvest always brought resentment. But the laughter didn't last long. A boy spat near her gate. A woman who once asked for time turned her face away. The priest mentioned unnatural plenty in his sermon. And when a late frost struck again, killing the blossoms in every yard but hers, they didn't ask how she saved her apricots. They said she had known, that she had planned, that she had hidden the cold from her own trees while letting theirs suffer. Her success became a kind of theft, something taken from others, not earned, and she began to see it, the way they looked at her rows like they were too full, too clean, too quiet, like something alive was waiting just beneath the leaves, teeth bared. The garden fed her, but it no longer protected her. It became a mirror of their fear. When the wind moved through it, they said it was whispering. When the crows avoided it, they said she had made a pact. When the roots pulled up clean and strong, they said the devil held the spade. No amount of sharing helped. She gave away garlic, lent her shears, showed them how to dig trenches against the rain. But it wasn't what they wanted. They didn't want her help. They wanted her to fail with them, to struggle, to starve, to lose. Her garden refused. And in doing so, it betrayed her. Because in a village where blessings were rare, abundance wasn't a gift. It was a warning, a bright, blooming target. And she stood alone in the middle of it, hands dirty, apron full, waiting for them to decide what green truly meant. It slipped out once, and that was all it took. A single word, strange to their ears, smooth and sharp, like a stone turned in the mouth. She had said it without thinking, murmured it under her breath while sorting dried herbs, the way some women sang to themselves or counted aloud to keep their hands steady. Someone had been nearby, maybe a child, maybe a man passing by the window, and they heard it. Not the meaning, just the sound. And it wasn't a village word. It wasn't from the market or the church. It was old, foreign, book-bound, Latin. That night, 2 women crossed themselves as she walked past. The next morning, someone asked her where she had learned to speak like that. She smiled, confused, and said it was only a phrase her father had used when reading aloud. He had been a scribe once in another town. She didn't remember much else, but the explanation didn't matter. What mattered was that she had spoken it, out loud, without shame. Knowledge had a place, and it wasn't in the mouths of women. The priest read Latin, yes, and maybe 1 or 2 of the older boys, if their fathers could spare them from the fields. But a woman who spoke the language of scripture, of learning, of authority, that was something else. Something unnatural. She wasn't a nun. She wasn't a healer trained in the city. She was just a woman with calloused fingers and a garden behind her house. So where had the words come from? If not God, then who? The villagers didn't ask that question directly. They asked it sideways. They asked if she'd ever been to the monastery, if she owned books, if she'd spoken those words near a sick child or during a storm. They asked with the kind of tone that didn't want an answer, only confirmation. She stopped using the words, of course, stopped even thinking them. But that didn't erase them from the minds of others. Now everything she said sounded different. Her voice became suspicious, too careful, too measured. If she hesitated, it meant she was hiding something. If she spoke plainly, it meant she was calculating. She began to feel like every sentence was being weighed, tested for traces of forbidden knowledge. And it wasn't just Latin. It was everything. The way she knew when the frost would come. The way she remembered dates without a calendar. The way she noticed things before others did. A shift in the wind, the sickness in a cow's eyes. Once this had been seen as skill. Now it was a threat. Not because it harmed anyone, but because it didn't fit. The priest said nothing at first, but his silence grew thick. Then, one Sunday, he gave a sermon about humility, about the sin of seeking what was not given, about the danger of women who thought they could learn without guidance. He didn't say her name. He didn't have to. People turned to look at her without turning their heads. She felt the weight of their stillness pressing in on her ribs. That afternoon, a child knocked over her bucket and didn't apologize. The next day, someone threw ashes on her doorstep. The next week, the whispers returned. She writes at night, they said. She speaks to the stars. She keeps a book under her bed, wrapped in cloth. None of it was true. Or maybe some of it was, once. But now the truth had nothing to do with it. The Latin had been the doorway. And now they didn't see a woman who knew a few old words. They saw a woman who knew too much. And in a place where survival depended on sameness, too much was always too dangerous to allow. The tears came too early. That was the problem. She wept when they questioned her name, not when they mentioned the devil. She wept at the doorway when they arrived in a group with folded arms and practiced expressions, but not in the chapel when the priest said her soul was in danger. Her tears fell when no one wanted them, when they still believed they could find the truth gently, without bruises, and so the crying became a sign, not of fear, not of pain, but of guilt. Why would an innocent woman cry so soon, so hard, with nothing yet decided? Why would she shake when no one had raised a hand? They said she was trying to earn pity, that she was preparing them for a lie. And once they said it, no one wanted to be the one she had tricked. They would have doubted her even if she hadn't cried. That was the other side of it. If she had stood dry-eyed, they would have said she was cold, too composed, not shaken enough. But something about those first tears, soft, desperate, unexpected, made them lean back. She hadn't waited for the charges to be read. She hadn't asked what they wanted. She had simply seen the line of boots outside her door and broken open. And in their minds, that meant something had already broken inside her. Guilt announces itself early, they said. A clear conscience waits. Her hands wiped her cheeks with the edge of her sleeve, again and again, as if she could undo what they now believed. But tears are sticky things. Once seen, they're never forgotten. The women were the worst. Not cruel, not openly. But still they judged. She had helped birth their children, given them herbs for cramps and prayers for stillness. But now they whispered that crying at the wrong time meant she was already bargaining, that she was trying to soften the blow of something she knew would come, that only a witch would cry before being called one. One of them said she'd seen it before, with her cousin, long ago, in another town. That one had cried too, just like this, and was found with something strange buried beneath her doorstep. It wasn't true, but it didn't have to be. Memory bent easily in places where fear stood tall, and once the comparison was made, it stuck like smoke in cloth. She stopped crying after that, willed the tears back into her throat, clenched her jaw, kept her breath tight and her face still. But the damage had been done. Now every word she spoke was watched more closely, every silence interpreted, every blink measured. They no longer saw a frightened woman. They saw someone who had tried to manipulate them, someone who had shown her hand too soon. And in the strange arithmetic of accusation, emotion became evidence, not in its content, but in its timing. If you weep too early, you're hiding something. If you weep too late, you're lying. If you don't weep at all, you're not human. And in that narrow space between suspicion and certainty, her tears, honest, instinctive, human, became a mark against her, a stain no water could wash away. They called it a trial, but there was no balance, no mercy, no search for truth. It was a ritual, dressed in the language of justice, meant not to uncover innocence but to confirm suspicion. She stood before them barefoot, hands bound, lips cracked from hours without water. The questions were sharp, circular things, designed not to inform but to trap. Why do your neighbors fear you? Why do animals follow you? Have you ever spoken to something that wasn't there? Each answer became a thread in the same rope. If she denied, it was defensiveness. If she confessed confusion, it was avoidance. And if she stayed silent, it was arrogance. They didn't want explanations. They wanted the illusion of process, a form to wrap around a foregone conclusion. Then came the tests, the ones they swore were old and reliable. She would be tied and thrown into water, a pond, a river, a trough deep enough to swallow her. If she sank, the water had accepted her. She was innocent, dead, but innocent. If she floated, the water had rejected her. The devil kept her light, and that was proof. They said it was fair, that it left the judgment to God. But God didn't tie the knots. God didn't push her from the ledge. God didn't stand on the bank, arms crossed, waiting for her body to rise. That was them. Men with ropes and reasons, women with whispers and cold hands. The fairness was a lie, so old they no longer recognized it as one. Sometimes the test changed. They might prick her skin with needles, looking for places that didn't bleed or feel pain. Signs, they said, of the devil's mark. They might force her to hold a hot iron and walk 3 steps. If her burns healed clean, she was blessed. If they festered, she was cursed. She saw others before her, their palms blistered, their shoulders torn from hours of hanging by the wrists. No one passed. Not really. A woman cleared of charges was still watched, still followed, still spat at in the market. The trial never ended. Even if the fire didn't take you, the eyes did. The hands, the doubt, the quiet punishment of being marked and left alive. She knew this. Knew it before the rope wrapped her wrists, before the cold water closed over her head. She didn't pray for fairness. She prayed for breath, for silence, for the strength not to flail, because even that would be seen as resistance. She let the water fill her ears, her mouth, her eyes, hoping it would end there, in the dark, without a verdict. But they pulled her out, coughing and shivering, not to save her, to accuse her. She had floated, they said. She had not sunk fast enough. She had risen as if held, and no one asked how a body bound and half-starved could sink like stone. No one cared. The trial had served its purpose. She was guilty now, not in deed, but in design, and there was no fairness left to weigh that truth. Only fire, only rope, only the same hands that tied her, now pretending they had no choice. They were asked, not ordered. That was important. No one forced them. No one threatened. The priest simply said it was time, and the reeve explained what was needed. Rope, dry wood, nails thick enough to hold through wind and thrashing, a stake tall enough to be seen from a distance. And the villagers, farmers, blacksmiths, boys old enough to carry weight, nodded without protest. They brought what they had, chopped the wood from old fences, splintered carts, last year's storm-felled trees. They coiled rope from barns and pulled nails from sheds. Each piece carried the smell of soil and sweat. Each hand that delivered it did so with a strange calm. Not joy, not rage, just duty. As if this too was part of their harvest. Something ugly but necessary. No one asked who she was. Not anymore. Not the woman who'd once helped mend sleeves, or fetched water when someone fell sick, or pulled a boy from the river after winter thaw. Now she was only the accused, the witch, the cause, the center of a silence no one wanted to leave empty. They didn't look her in the eye as they stacked the wood, but they didn't look away either. Eyes slid over her like fog, never resting, never engaging, but always aware. She watched from the holding shed, hands bound, face smeared with ash and sleep. They let her see. That was part of it, letting her watch her own ending come together, piece by piece, from the hands of the people she once called neighbors. The blacksmith hammered the nails without speaking. His apprentice helped drive them through the base of the stake into the platform. A farmer brought a wheelbarrow full of kindling. He even apologized when some spilled, then went quiet again. A boy no older than 13 laid a bundle of twigs under the ropes. He had been told this was righteous, that the devil feared fire, that they were doing God's work, and so they brought what they had, not out of cruelty, but because they were part of a system that made silence look like complicity and action look like cleansing. To refuse would have been noticed, to question would have been remembered, and no one wanted to be the next name whispered after dark. By the time the sun reached its highest point, the pile was ready. Clean, dry, built for efficiency, not pain, though pain would come anyway. The rope was tied properly. The nails held. The wood would catch quickly, it always did. And when it burned, no one would claim responsibility. They would say it was justice, that she brought it on herself, that her words, her eyes, her silences, those were what lit the match. But the truth lay scattered in their hands, in the knots they tied, the wood they gathered, the nails they drove deep. The fire didn't come from nowhere, it came from them, from their duty, from the quiet, terrible relief of doing what was expected, and nothing more. At first they still said her name, quietly, hesitantly, in the past tense. Marta helped my mother when she was sick. I remember when Marta used to sing at the spring. But within days it began to fade. It wasn't a decision. No one stood and said she would be unnamed. It happened slowly, as if her syllables had become too heavy, too sharp to carry. People began to refer to her with space between their teeth. That woman. Her. The one who, you know. And then, inevitably, the witch. The title swallowed everything. It rewrote her story, erased her family, painted over her history. Whatever kindness she had offered, whatever pain she had carried, all of it fell beneath that single, blunt word. Witch. It echoed more than her name ever had. Children were the fastest to forget. They had called her by name when she gave them berries or shooed them from thorn bushes. But now, they said, the witch lives there, pointing at her empty cottage, eyes wide with tales they barely understood. The adults corrected them only in tone, not in words. Don't talk about her, they'd mutter. That one is gone now. And when her death came, tied and burned or crushed and buried, they didn't mark her grave with stone or wood. No letters, no date. If they buried her at all, They did it in the farthest patch of soil, where the weeds grew thick and the ground stayed wet. No prayers were said, no tears allowed, and if someone asked who lay there, the answer was only, "A witch." Nothing more. Her name had no place among the remembered. Even her belongings were scrubbed clean of her. The bowl she lent stayed untouched. The dress she'd mended was thrown into the fire. A child who once bore her name was called something else, for safety. The priest removed her from the records. Not formally, just a small, practiced pause when listing the faithful, skipping where her name would have been. Her story became a warning, not a memory. No one said how she laughed or how she used to cry over old songs. No one said she had loved once or that she had been a child herself, long ago, with muddy knees and sun-warmed skin. The woman she was vanished, and in her place stood a shape, burned, feared, pointed at. But names do not die easily. They stay under breath in the hush of those who still remember. A girl once helped by her might whisper it at night, alone in bed. An old man might say it in prayer, quickly, like a sin he hopes is forgiven. Still, the village never speaks it aloud. It lives at the bottom of throats, stuck behind teeth. Because to speak her name would be to admit that she was real, that she had been one of them, that they had known her, and that makes what they did harder to carry. Easier then to say witch, easier to make her disappear completely. Not just in the body, not just in the fire, but in memory, in story, in name. And once that name is gone, there is no one left to mourn. Only smoke, only silence, only the echo of what they chose to forget. They began early, before the sun cleared the rooftops. Long, ragged sounds carried on the morning air. Too sharp to be wind, too broken to be words. And yet no one paused. No one turned toward them with alarm. The baker kept kneading dough. A woman drew water from the well without lifting her head. Children herded goats with sticks and half laughter, stepping over puddles as though nothing had happened. The screams had become background, folded into the village's rhythm like the creak of wheels or the bark of dogs. They came from the shed behind the chapel, or the cellar near the priest's house, or sometimes from the edge of the woods where the soil was soft and the rope could be tied low. No one needed to ask why. They already knew. It was the sound a woman made when her body was being bent to fit someone else's story. It wasn't just pain. There was panic in the sound, the kind that stretched a voice beyond what it could hold. A wild, tearing pitch that clawed against stone and wood. But it passed quickly. It always did. A minute, 2, then muffled sobs, then silence. The village breathed around it, worked around it, slept through it. The screams were no longer treated as warning signs, they were confirmation. That justice was being done. That danger had a voice, and it had been caught, and so they allowed it to happen. Not because they were cruel, but because cruelty done slowly, in daylight, with the blessing of the cross and the nod of a magistrate, doesn't feel like cruelty anymore. It feels like order, like faith, like doing what must be done. Sometimes a mother would flinch. A girl would pause with her hands in the water. A boy would glance toward the sound and ask a question no one wanted to answer. But the flinches faded. The glances turned away. Children learned quickly when not to speak, when to pretend they hadn't heard. They learned that silence meant safety, that sympathy was dangerous, that questions invited eyes, and eyes led to whispers, and whispers could lead to screaming of your own. Better to keep your head down, better to stay still. The screams belonged to someone else, someone already decided, someone who, even if she lived, would not come back the same, if she came back at all. There were days when the sky stayed grey and the air thick, and still the sound would rise, hoarse, brittle, reaching. And on those days, it mixed with the bell, ringing for prayer. and no one could tell where one ended and the other began. A boy once said, "She's crying like the lambs do before the knife," and was cuffed hard for it. But he was right. There was something animal in it, something raw and pleading that didn't belong to sin or guilt. It belonged to fear, to pain, to the knowledge that nothing, she said, no truth she offered, would be enough. And so the screams came, and the village let them come. Because they were used to it, because they told themselves it was necessary, because when cruelty becomes routine, it stops sounding like cruelty. It starts sounding like life, like any other morning, like the price of peace. The girl was 7, maybe 8. Her dress was too short, her hands too small to carry the weight of what she was about to say. But they brought her forward anyway, gently, as if she were being honored. She stood in front of the gathered crowd, blinking into the sunlight, with 2 women behind her and the priest beside. She didn't speak at first. She looked at the ground, then at the woman tied to the post, then back at the crowd. Someone whispered, "Go on, child." Another said, "Just like we practiced." And she began. The words came slowly, shaped more by memory than understanding. She touched my arm and said something I didn't know. After that, my dog got sick." A murmur moved through the crowd. The girl's lip trembled, and she looked at me. Strange. The tears came on cue, real ones, not from fear of the woman, but from fear of doing it wrong. She had been told this was important, that people would listen, that she was brave. Children didn't always understand what they were part of. They knew when to be quiet, when to nod, when to say yes. That woman came to the door. Yes, she asked me to hold a basket. Yes, I heard her say a strange word when the fire went out. They repeated what they had heard, from parents, from priests, from the older boys who talked too loudly in the fields. Some said it like play acting, their voices proud, their chins lifted. Others whispered, unsure, their eyes flicking between faces for approval. It didn't matter. Once the words were spoken, they couldn't be taken back. A child's accusation held a special weight, not because it was more accurate, but because it sounded pure. A child wouldn't lie, they said. A child wouldn't know how to invent such things. And so the child became the instrument of certainty, sharpened, pointed, and thrust forward without guilt. There were boys too. One claimed a woman had flown above his house. Another said she whispered to a snake in the field. They described dreams they didn't have, touches that never happened, gifts that were never given. Sometimes they said these things with confidence, other times with blankness in their eyes. The look of someone who had practiced too many times and no longer knew what the story was. The adults nodded, encouraged, wept. Some even knelt beside the child and thanked them for their bravery. They told the little ones they were helping. They told them they were saving the village. They never told them the truth, that they were being used, bent into tools, given the kind of power no child should carry. And when the flames came, or the sentence was passed, no one asked the child again. They had already done their part. She saw their faces. The women who were accused always did. They looked at the children not with anger, but with something quieter, sadder. They knew what had happened. They remembered what it was like to be small and afraid, to want praise, to believe the grown-ups when they said something mattered. And so they didn't shout when the child pointed. They didn't curse or cry out. They just lowered their eyes as if to shield the child from what came next. But the children always looked anyway. Some cried again, some didn't. Some ran when the smoke began. Some stayed until it was done. And after, they grew up into men and women who carried a weight they could never name. Not guilt, not exactly, but a silence too deep to speak, because they had once been asked to point, and they had obeyed. The morning after the fire, the village was strangely quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't come from grief, but from something closer to relief. There was no ash in the wind. It had settled in the grass overnight. The smell still lingered faintly, a mixture of smoke and charred fabric and something sweeter, more human. But the air felt lighter somehow. People said it outright, even if they didn't quite believe it. It's done now. Things will be better. We've driven it out. They said the village felt cleaner, like a sickness had passed, like some unseen weight had been lifted from their shoulders. No one mentioned the body. No one walked near the scorched ground where the fire had burned hottest. They simply stepped around it, the way one avoids a puddle or a dead animal in the road. The priest spoke in calm tones that morning. He talked of cleansing, of spiritual renewal, of how darkness, once exposed, loses its grip. He said they were safe again, and many believed him. The market reopened early. Bread sold fast. A boy laughed too loudly and no one scolded him. The women didn't linger at the well, but they smiled at each other as they passed. It was as if something had been pulled from under their skin, an itch, a splinter, something too small to name, but too sharp to ignore. Even the dogs seemed calmer, resting in doorways with their heads on their paws. And no one spoke of her, not directly, only in half phrases and small nods. She's gone. That's over now. We'll sleep better. The fire had left a hole, but they filled it with routine, with tidiness, with silence. But the silence had edges. No one said it aloud, but they all felt it. The sense that something had shifted beneath the surface, that the fear wasn't gone, only redirected, that maybe what they'd burned wasn't the cause, but the symptom. Still they clung to the feeling of cleanliness, of order, the way the streets looked brighter, the way the sky seemed wider, the way they could walk past her house without looking at the window. That was what they wanted. A world that made sense again. And if it took a fire to build that illusion, then so be it. Some swept their doorsteps more thoroughly. Some scrubbed pots with more vigor. A woman hung new herbs in her doorway, not for healing, but for protection. They called it starting fresh. They called it being cautious. But really it was fear wrapped in habit. Because beneath the calm, they knew it would come again. Not the same way, maybe. Not the same woman. But the whispers would return. The unease. The need to name a cause. To hold someone responsible for the rot and the drought and the dying animals. And when it did, they would do it all over again. But for now, there was space to breathe. For now, the air felt clean. And they clung to that feeling, the way one clings to a lie told often enough to become comfort. Not because it was true, but because it was easier than remembering the shape of the scream, or the color of the smoke, or the name they swore they had already forgotten. They didn't hate her. Not really. They didn't throw stones, didn't spit at her door, didn't shout her name when the accusations began. But they also didn't speak. Not to her. Not for her. When she passed them in the lane, carrying water with both wrists bound in rope burn, they looked at the ground. When she was led to the chapel, barefoot and stiff from the cold, they watched the dust around her feet instead of the face they'd once called friend. She searched their faces one by one, and what she found wasn't contempt. It was absence, hollowed-out gazes, turned shoulders, fingers twisting apron strings. No one stopped the priest. No one raised a voice to ask what exactly she had done, because they knew it didn't matter. If they spoke, if they reached out, if they showed anything that could be mistaken for mercy, they would be next. They had shared things once. Bread, stories, blood. She had helped one of them deliver a breech child. Another she had pulled out of a well when they were both girls. She remembered holding a hand during a funeral, wrapping a shawl around someone's shoulders during the bitter frost. but memory turned soft under fear. And in the weeks between whisper and trial, everything rewrote itself. The woman she had nursed through fever now said nothing when they passed in the market. The one who had begged for her moon tea now spoke of strange herbs and odd silences. They weren't cruel. They were afraid. Afraid of the way suspicion spread, of how fast a single glance could be misread, of how easily kindness could be twisted into guilt. So they pulled back, bit their tongues, lowered their eyes and told themselves it was for their children, their husbands, their safety. She understood. That was the worst part. She didn't curse them, didn't shout at them from her place in the square, hands bound, mouth dry with smoke and dust. She had known this silence would come. It always did. The moment one woman is called witch, the rest must become ghosts. They erase her from memory even before the fire touches her feet. Not because they want to forget, but because remembering is dangerous. To say, "She was my friend," is to stand too close to the edge. So they whisper prayers for her behind closed doors. They touch the place where she once sat and say nothing. And when their daughters ask who that woman was, they say, "No one." And the girls learn early what silence costs and what it protects. Later, some of them will regret it, when the danger has passed, when it is safe again to remember. They'll recall how she looked that day in the square, not angry, not even sad, just tired. They'll remember the small bruise on her collarbone, the dirt under her nails, the way her eyes searched for something that wasn't there. They'll wonder what might have happened if even one of them had stepped forward, said her name, taken her hand. But by then she'll be ash, and regret will be as useless as courage come too late. And so they'll look down again, not at her this time, but at their own hands, at their own silence, at the fear that still sits under their ribs, whispering that next time it might be them, and that no one will look up, not even once. It started with a voice in the dark, not a scream, not a call for help, just a low murmur that drifted through the stillness like smoke. A neighbor passing by her cottage late one evening paused and tilted his head. He couldn't make out the words, only the rhythm, soft, measured, almost like prayer. He told himself it was nothing, just a woman alone, talking to herself. But by morning he had told 2 others. By nightfall the story had grown teeth. They said she chanted, that her voice changed, that the words didn't sound like any prayer they knew. She denied it, of course, said she was singing to keep warm, whispering to remember a recipe, repeating a verse her mother once taught her. But they had already decided, no one who spoke into empty air was truly alone. In a village where silence meant safety, any sound without a listener was dangerous. A woman talking to herself could be seen as forgetful. A girl humming while she worked might be considered strange. But do it too often, and it became something else. Suspicion crept in through the smallest cracks, a whispered name in the garden, a lullaby sung to no one. She wasn't shouting, she wasn't cursing, but the sound of her voice, heard through wood and stone, stirred something uneasy, especially at night, especially when sleep was thin and shadows moved too easily across the walls. People said they heard her when they couldn't sleep. They said it woke them, unsettled them, made their skin crawl. They didn't know what she said, but they knew they didn't like the way she said it. They listened for her after that. Not openly, but in passing, slowing their steps near her window, pausing with buckets at the well if they thought she might speak again. They began to catalogue every sound. A sigh became a sign, a cough, a code. Once a child swore he heard her laugh alone in the dark, and that sealed it. No one laughed alone unless they were mocking something holy, or someone, or both. Her voice, once just a part of her, became a weapon in their hands. something to repeat, to exaggerate, to fear. When the priest asked her directly if she spoke to unseen spirits, she hesitated, just for a moment. Enough for them to say she had confessed with her silence. Enough for them to nod to one another with grim satisfaction. She stopped speaking aloud after that, let her thoughts sit heavy in her chest, unspoken and bitter. But silence didn't save her. It only made them say she had moved on to thinking curses instead of saying them. That now the devil had taught her to whisper without lips, to pray without sound. There was no right answer. Her voice was proof when heard, and guilt when gone. And the cruelest part was that she had never spoken to summon anything. She had only been lonely, only trying to fill the air with something human. A memory, a melody, a name she hadn't said in years. But they didn't care what she meant. They only cared that someone heard, that the words had escaped. And once a voice left a woman's mouth without permission, it no longer belonged to her. It belonged to them, to twist, to fear, to burn. She hadn't confessed when they first accused her. She'd stood still, blinking against the sunlight, her wrists bound and her mouth too dry to form full sentences. She said she didn't know why they had come, that she hadn't cursed the well, hadn't touched the mayor's daughter, hadn't seen the devil in any shape or shadow. Her voice trembled, but her words held. That was not what they wanted. They wanted certainty. They wanted fear to take form. And so the waiting began. She was locked in a room with no window and a floor that never dried. Her ankles swelled, her skin blistered. They brought food and water at irregular hours, just enough to keep her upright. Each time the door opened, she flinched. Not from pain, that came later, but from hope. From the idea that maybe someone had come to say they were wrong. No one did. When the pain began, it was slow. A wooden wedge between the fingers. A knot tightened just enough to leave bruises, then tightened again. They said it was for truth, that God would protect her if she were innocent. That pain was simply the devil's grip slipping. At first she cried out, instinctively, helplessly. But the cries didn't matter. What they wanted wasn't noise, it was surrender. So they pressed harder. Heat followed. Not flame, not yet, but iron heated until it shimmered. They touched it to her thigh, her ribs, the soft underside of her arm. She screamed then, louder, and they said it was the devil resisting. That meant they were close. The priest came after that with calm words and a kind voice. He told her that confession would end it, that if she only spoke the truth, the pain would stop, that God would forgive her, that death, once she admitted, would be clean. Quick, almost gentle. She didn't believe them. Not at first, not even after they broke the skin. But the days blurred, and her thoughts grew slow. Her body became something separate from her, something raw and swollen and unfamiliar. They brought her outside once, just briefly, to show her the stake. It stood tall in the square, surrounded by wood stacked too carefully. They said her name. They said the date. And they said it would be easier if she confessed. That the people would accept her remorse. That she wouldn't scream for long. That they would make it fast. The wind carried the smell of animals and old bread. The sky was pale. And she knew then that they didn't care what she had done. They only cared what she would say. So she said it, not all at once, and not in full, but she gave them pieces, that she had cursed a cow, that she had spoken to a shadow, that she had wished someone harm. The lies tasted like blood, thick and metallic. But each one made them nod, made the pressure ease. The priest held her hand and whispered that she was brave, that she was choosing the right path, that her soul was no longer in danger. She asked if she would still burn. He said yes, but gently. He said the flames would come either way. This way she met them with peace, with salvation. And when the fire rose, she closed her eyes. Not because she was at peace, but because she had nothing left to say. And the confession they wanted had taken everything else. They said they saw her in the sky, not just once, but many times, always at dusk, when the fields went grey and the shadows stretched long. They said her hair floated behind her like smoke, and her feet didn't touch the ground. She wore no cloak, no shoes, no crown, only the wind. Sometimes she flew over the river, sometimes above the chapel roof. A boy claimed she passed over his window while he prayed. A woman swore she saw her outlined against the moon. No one asked how. No one wondered why no one else saw it. They didn't need to. The idea was enough. The image too vivid to doubt. They had heard the stories since childhood. Witches who flew to meet the devil, who danced naked on mountaintops, who soared above farms and cursed them from the sky. Now they had one of their own. The first story came from an old man half-blind and near death. He said he saw her fly when he woke to piss in the yard. No one laughed. Instead, they nodded slowly. That made sense, they said. He had always been a good man. He wouldn't lie. And soon, others remembered things too. A breeze that came from nowhere, a crow that circled her roof 3 times, a door that opened without touch. She must have flown, they decided. How else could she have gotten to the woods so quickly? How else could she have appeared near the mayor's sick child and then vanished by morning? The mind doesn't need proof. It needs pattern. Once the idea took hold, everything pointed toward it. And when someone suggested she had flown not just once but many times, it became history. They didn't ask her. They didn't need her side. A woman's denial weighed less than a child's dream, less than the rustling of leaves in a still grove. And when they looked at her, small, hunched dirt under her nails, they didn't see the absurdity. They saw her as they had imagined her, hair wild, body arched in flight, face lit by unnatural fire. Her silence became arrogance, her stillness a mask. She must have flown, they insisted, because no one could live so far from town and not belong to another world. Because no ordinary woman could know which herbs soothed a cough or how to draw water even when the well seemed dry. Those were not things learned, they were given. Gifts from dark forces. And gifts, in their eyes, always came at a price. So they tied her hands tighter, just in case. They looked to the sky when they lit the fire, watching for signs of wings. And when she screamed, they said it was the wind being driven from her bones, that she was trying to rise again, that they had caught her just in time. They never saw her feet leave the ground, but they saw it in their minds. And that was enough. The fire burned not just her body, but the image they had made, the flying woman, the dangerous freedom, the one who did not stay where she was told. They said she flew, and then they made sure she never would again. By morning, the fire was gone. Just a circle of scorched ground where grass no longer grew and stones cracked from heat. The stake had collapsed inward, blackened and brittle. No bones, no cloth, no trace of her hair or hands or the eyes that had once searched the crowd for something human. Only ash, a soft grey layer carried by the wind and mixed with the dust that already clung to every surface of the village. Some of it settled near the well, some on the priest's steps. Some found its way into the air, breathed in by the very mouths that had cursed her. No one spoke of that. They said the smoke had risen clean, that the fire had done its work, that it was finished now. But something lingered. The smell, maybe, sharp and sour like burnt linen and old blood. Or maybe it was the way the grass refused to return, even weeks later, even after rain. Children avoided the spot, pretending not to glance at it when they passed. Animals paused and stepped wide. A woman once tried to plant herbs nearby, and they withered without blooming. The ashes had vanished, carried off by boots and wind, but their presence remained. Not visible, not loud. Just a faint suggestion in the soil, a memory the land refused to swallow. Those who came close said the air was different there, thin, dry, as if something sacred had been broken. No one gathered the ashes. No urn, no burial. There was no funeral. No one claimed to know where her family had gone, if she had any left. And even if they had come, they wouldn't have been given anything. There was nothing to bury, not a tooth, not a button, not a name. She had been reduced completely, to smoke, to rumor, to absence. And in that absence the villagers found comfort. They said she had been erased, that her spirit had no anchor, that her evil had been burned from the world entirely. But they still looked over their shoulders, still added salt to their doorways, and turned spoons in their pots 3 times, just in case, because they didn't understand what they had done, only what they had removed. Ash is light. It doesn't ask permission. It clings to skin, to fabric, to breath. And so, though she was gone, though the fire had claimed all it could, pieces of her remained. On the soles of those who built the pyre, in the folds of the apron worn by the woman who handed over the kindling, in the folds of the priest's robe, heavy with smoke. She didn't haunt them. She didn't return. But she never truly left. Her body was gone, yes, but her story had settled into the dust. And dust, unlike memory, never forgets. It waits, quiet, invisible, and always close. It took less than a week. The ashes were still in the grass, scattered thin beneath the breeze, when the murmurs began again. Not loud, not urgent, just the familiar rhythm of suspicion finding a new shape. This time it was the weaver's wife. She had been strange lately, they said, wandering outside after dusk, asking questions that weren't hers to ask. One man claimed she had stared too long at a dying sheep. Another said her herbs smelled different, not like medicine, but like rot. No one remembered when the rumors started, only that they made sense the moment they were spoken. The village needed someone. Someone to point at, someone to watch, someone to blame. The fire hadn't cleansed the fear. It had only cleared space for the next name. The priest didn't speak right away. He waited, as always, for the momentum to grow, for fear to do its own work. And it did. A child had nightmares. A woman miscarried. A cow's milk went sour. 3 things in 3 days, more than enough to draw a line. The people brought it to him gently, as if delivering a burden too heavy to carry alone. "We don't want to accuse," they said, "but we can't ignore it either." He nodded with careful sadness, the kind that looked like wisdom. He said he would look into it, that they must be cautious. But they all knew how it would end. The words had been spoken. The pattern had begun. The mechanism had been reset. No one resisted. No one said, "We just did this." No one asked whether the fear that consumed one woman had ever truly left. They believed in the ritual now, in the rhythm. One name burned down to silence, then another rose like smoke. Some felt a flicker of guilt, but guilt softens quickly under routine. They said, "This one is different." They said, "We must be sure this time." But they gathered the rope, the wood, the questions just the same. Eyes watched her doorway. Steps slowed near her window. A man swore he saw a blackbird land on her roof and caw 3 times. No one asked what that meant. It didn't matter. The meaning was in the echo. And she felt it. The shift in how people stood. The way greetings faded. the way her name was replaced by pauses. She had seen it happen before, stood in the square when the last woman was tied to the stake, watched the smoke rise with the rest. She had wept quietly in her own kitchen, had lit a candle after dark and whispered prayers she no longer believed in. And now the silence had turned toward her. The wheel was spinning again, and she was under it. She hadn't changed, only the direction of their fear had. It needed a place to land. And once it did, it spread fast, like fire in dry grass. The truth didn't matter. The timing did. It was her turn now, that was all. They said she flew. They said her garden bloomed in winter. They said she whispered to animals and bled without pain and could call down storms with the tilt of her head. But no one really believed it. Not truly. Not in the private, silent part of themselves that still remembered who she had been before the whispers began. They remembered her smile, or her limp, or the way she offered broth to the sick without being asked. They knew she couldn't fly, that she couldn't curse a child just by looking, that the devil didn't visit her cottage on moonless nights. But belief was dangerous. Not in witches, in people, in the woman tied to the stake, in the thought that maybe the fear was wrong. So they didn't believe. Not out loud, not where it counted. What mattered wasn't truth. What mattered was movement, the nods, the murmurs, the quiet agreement that kept the wheel turning. To object would be to stand alone, and no one stood alone. Not unless they wanted the same fate. So they participated, passively. They looked away when the rope was tightened. They prayed quietly while the flames rose. They told their children not to stare, then stared themselves. They knew it wasn't real. They knew. But they also knew that doubt was a luxury. Doubt required safety. It required time. And neither existed when the fire was already stacked. Better to nod. Better to bow heads. Better to say, "She brought it on herself," and keep walking. There were moments, small, fragile, when someone might have spoken. When a neighbor stepped forward and said, "She helped me once," or "She was kind." But those voices always fell quiet. A look from the priest, a warning glance from a husband, the weight of a dozen eyes that said, "Don't." So they swallowed the truth. It sat heavy in their chests, dull and aching, like something broken that no longer needed repair. And eventually they forgot that they had ever doubted. Or at least they stopped admitting it. It was easier that way. Easier to remember her as the witch than as the woman. Easier to believe the lie you helped build than to see your own hand in the ruin. And so they lived on. The village stayed quiet. The fires burned when needed. Names came and went. And each time the silence grew thicker, the memory shorter. No one truly believed, but no one dared doubt. Not because the story made sense, but because doubt was fire. And fire, once it starts, doesn't care who's innocent. It only needs wood. It only needs silence. And it always finds both. So now you know how it worked. Not just the fire or the rope, or the accusation whispered through a closed door, but the quiet machinery underneath. The fear that spread like smoke. The silence that gave it shape. And how, in the end, it wasn't about witches at all. It was about control. About what happens when truth is less important than safety. When doubt is punished. When someone, anyone, must be burned just so the rest can sleep. These women weren't strangers to the people who condemned them. They shared bread, shared sickness, shared seasons. And still, when the air turned cold and the fields turned dry, someone remembered a strange look, or an herb, or a dream, and that was enough. One name, one rumor, one silence too long. That's all it ever took. So tonight, as you rest, remember her. Not the legend, but the woman beneath it. The one who knew too much, spoke too little, or simply lived alone. Remember what it cost her, and how quickly it could cost someone else.